Welcome to the Museum of Boring Things. Here, ordinary objects rest beneath the dust of time, gently sheltered in the muted glow of forgotten meanings. Each piece is carefully catalogued. A subscription merely records your name in the guest book. Tonight's exhibit is the button, shaped without flourish, born in shadow, yet indispensable in daily life, a quiet relic of anonymous brilliance. Let your thoughts uncoil, your breath soften. Should sleep arrive before the story ends, consider it a quiet gift from the collection. Now, let us open the glass case. It began with holes. Not the button itself, not yet, but the absence it would one day fill, the loose hem, the wind-whipped collar, the unfastened fold that whispered of incomplete form. Before there were button-ends, there were things in need of closing. And long before the button was invented, there were already loops, knots, pins, and the silent struggle between structure and softness. In the ancient soil of the Indus Valley, around 2800 BCE, small discs of shell were discovered, drilled with symmetrical holes, smoothed by the sea and then by hand. They served no clear fastening function, at least not by modern standards, but they were pierced, worn, arranged. Some believe they were decorative. Others suspect them of modest utilitarianism. In either case, the idea had germinated, that something small, round, and firm could mediate between garment and gravity. The air carried the dry rustle of linen against skin, the faint hush of felt gloves arranging the evidence. These early button-ends, if one dares call them such, were not yet buttons in the mechanical sense. They did not work alone. They were part of a duet, a buttonhole-less existence. And it would take centuries before the two would formally meet. The Bronze Age passed with its own clasps and toggles, fibulae, and pins. The button watched from the wings. It waited. By the 13th century in Germany, a new quietness entered the wardrobe. Garments began to shift from loose drapery to tailored form. To contour the human body was now a gesture of wealth, power, and design. And in this slow tightening of fabric, the button emerged again, not as decoration, but as closure. The buttonhole had arrived. With it came the true button, not simply as artifact, but as system. Like a snail slipping into its shell, the button now had a function. In medieval Europe, especially among the elite, the button spread with quiet insistence, a silken plague of round things. Dozens adorned the sleeves of doublets, the backs of gowns, the cuffs of collars, the flanks of bodices. Some sleeves required over 20 buttons, each one sewn on by hand, each with its partner slit carefully reinforced. The whisper of thread through wool joined the ambient creak of oiled leather chairs and the steady breath of tailors bent over candlelight. Material mattered. Early buttons were carved from bone, wood, horn, or ivory. Some were cast from pewter or bronze. As trade expanded, so too did the repertoire. Porcelain from China, jet from Whitby, silver from Spanish coin melt. The button became a catalogue of geography, a portable archaeology of empire and earth. One could, if quiet enough, hear the faint tick of a needle on bone, the soft scrape of file against shell. By the 16th and 17th centuries, buttons had grown ostentatious. Not content with closure, they craved attention. Velvet buttons covered in gold thread. Painted button-ends, glass buttons, buttons with tiny painted scenes within them. A single coat might cost more in buttons than in fabric. Courtly etiquette required their precise number and arrangement. A button out of place was no longer merely loose, it was incorrect. It was improper. Like a librarian juggling feathers, society kept its chaos hidden under a carefully fastened front. And yet, even now, the button remained an aristocrat. The poor closed their garments with strings, pins, belts. But the Industrial Revolution would inevitably democratize the clasp. In the 19th century, machines began to mass-produce buttons in earnest. A faint metallic rhythm echoed through the mills, punches, dies, molds, presses. Buttons were stamped from metal, poured in molds, turned on lathes. In America, buttons were increasingly made from vegetable ivory, the dense seed of the South American tagua palm. Smooth, carvable, and convincingly white, it mimicked bone without the bother of butchery. Patents bloomed. Button-making machines emerged, efficient and tireless. The mother-of-pearl button industry in Muscatine, Iowa, flourished along the Mississippi, where clammers harvested freshwater mussels by the ton. Their shells were sliced into blanks, drilled and polished. The air there smelled of wet limestone and distant algae. The soft, hollow sound of a shell rolling across a wooden workbench echoed beneath the din of machines. The button became cheap. It became silent. No longer a symbol, no longer a sign, but a default. But given shirts expected them, trousers relied on them. The button vanished into assumption, into ubiquity. So common, it became invisible until it failed. A popped button marked a day's quiet unraveling. The tactile search of thumb and forefinger patting a coat for reassurance became one of modern life's softest gestures. There were wartime shortages, of course, metal buttons redirected to munitions. Bakelite buttons made in haste. Uniforms required standardization, rows of dull brown discs sewn tight by regulation. One could trace entire regiments by their buttons alone. Each military used its own codes, crest, alloys. A fallen soldier might be identified only by what remained sewn to his chest. In those times, the button did not merely close fabric. It preserved identity. It stitched memory to form. As the 20th century advanced, plastic found the button. Or rather, it consumed it. Casein first, derived from milk proteins, brittle, absorbent, prone to warping in damp air. Then came urea formaldehyde, resistant to wear and delightfully moldable. And finally, the synthetic coup, polyester resin. Suddenly, buttons could be anything. Simulated tortoiseshell, faux horn, glossy imitation pearl. Color bled into form, mint green for summer dresses, rust red for autumn coats, pale yellow for infant sleepwear. They were cast by the millions. Their surfaces cool to the touch, like the skin of a mannequin left overnight in an unlit shop window. In this new age of volume, the button's soul dispersed. No longer carved or cut, it was now pressed and popped, identical, undistinguished. The same design might appear on a seamstress' blouse in Prague and a child's school uniform in Snow Polo. There was something almost metaphysical in this sameness, as though buttons had become the punctuation of the global garment. Quite commas closing the sentence of a sleeve. The air in the factory halls where they were made held the dry scent of mold release agents and oil, overlaid with the faintest trace of cellulose dust. Not all buttons served to fasten. Some were purely symbolic, sewn shut, decorative only. Military buttons whose holes had no hole behind them. Fashion buttons on cuffs that opened nowhere. The gesture remained even when the function vanished. This residue of intention, this echo of necessity, whispered of the human tendency to preserve form long after need has passed. Like setting a place at the table for someone long gone, it was both tender and absurd. Designs evolved, sometimes garishly. Novelty buttons, shaped like ducks, dice, daisies. Buttons with slogans. Buttons that blinked. But beneath the whimsy, a kind of quiet standard held firm. 4 holes evenly spaced, the logic of tension and release. Some variations experimented with shanks, loops, or snap mechanisms, but the core principle remained stubborn. Pressure, alignment, closure. The button did not compete. It persisted. There were exceptions, of course. The zipper, a younger cousin with more ambition, threatened to displace it. Patented in the early 20th century, the zipper offered speed, uniformity, and the thrill of linear motion. It hissed rather than clicked. But it lacked the intimacy of the button, that tactile negotiation between fingers and thread. You never really touched a zipper. You operated it. A button, by contrast, asked something of you. Precision, attention, time. The whispered resistance of thread slipping into fabric greeted each attempt. Even so, by mid-century, zippers conquered jackets, jeans, and dresses. Velcro, magnets, elastic, they all took their share. Yet the button remained like a well-behaved tenant in an old apartment. Quite tidy, unobtrusive. Particularly in the world of shirts, it held its ground. The dress shirt, with its firm collar and disciplined row of tiny closures, remained a domain ruled by the button. The ritual of dressing, performed with slow fingers at dawn or dusk, held something monkish. One small closure after another, a measured readiness. The soft tug of cotton against buttonhole stitched itself into memory. As manufacturing globalized, button production moved to where hands were cheapest and voices least heard. In places like Hangzhou, China, a town that, at its peak, produced over 60% of the world's buttons, small factories lined narrow streets, their walls echoing with the muted clatter of plastic blanks striking concrete floors. Children there grew up under the faint smell of resin and dye. The button was no longer a thing one made, it was a condition one lived inside. Yet in parallel, the button also ascended, not in status, but in abstraction. In digital interfaces, we borrowed the word and flattened its meaning. A button became an icon to press. No holes, no thread, no friction. Just a symbol of something that might happen. Click to save, click to close, click to forget. The etymology remained while the texture evaporated. You could press hundreds a day and never feel a thing. A button was now an act without substance. The silent breath of the old wardrobe was gone, replaced by the sterile tap of glass under fingertip. In museums and collector drawers, real buttons, old ones, heavy with patina or hand-carved imperfection, took on a new quietness. You could hear it if you were still enough. The soft clink of bone against bone as a handful was turned over in a palm. The slow glide it felt as drawers were opened, gloved fingers lifting one example at a time. Every culture had made them. Every era had worn them. Each tiny disc carried a different story of closure, form, and fashion. Like a sleeping coin with no denomination, the button never truly expired. It merely waited to be noticed. And there were buttons that vanished entirely. Buttons from uniforms lost at sea. Buttons swallowed by earth in forgotten graves. Buttons from love letters sewn into jacket linings. Each disappearance whispered a quiet truth. That small things, unnoticed in their time, become vessels of meaning precisely because they were overlooked. You do not mourn a lost button until it is the last remaining proof that someone was once there. The button in the end is not so much a device as it is a decision, a slow, deliberate act to hold things together. And like all decisions made by hand, it carries the weight of its maker's attention. There are faster closures, neater ones, more efficient designs, but none that ask us to pause, align, and press through with care. Even in decline, the button endured with a stubborn humility. In thrift shops, tin boxes full of mismatched specimens still sat under the counter, faintly clinking when moved. Grandmothers kept them, not as collectors, but as stewards, a single jar of past garments, moments, repairs. Each button once matched something, someone, somewhere. Now they waited. The air in such places smelled of dust, dried soap, and the papery scent of old instruction manuals, folded once too many times. Instructions for machines no longer owned. Repair, not fashion, became the last domain of the button's dignity. A button lost was a minor crisis, a small domestic grief. You searched the floor, retraced your steps, checked pockets, whispered to yourself. Then came the ritual, choosing the new button it would never quite match, but it would do. Threading the needle, knotting the end, these were gestures of remembrance. The cloth might stretch oddly, the hole might pull, but the button was returned, and with it the garment's logic. There is a kind of modest grace in holding something together not perfectly but persistently. In the shadows of global fast fashion, buttons became disposable again. Garments came pre-weakened, planned obsolescence woven in, fastened with haste. Some buttons were barely attached, their threads looping like tired sighs. They tore off in laundromats and stairwells on buses. Often they were never replaced. The garment ended not in holes, but in absence, the echo of something that should have clicked. The murmur of a missing buttonhole filled the silence like the creak of floorboards in an empty room. Still, some buttons aspired. In haute couture, they returned not as closers, but as signatures. Custom-made, gilded, engraved. The button is jewel. These were not meant to be used, only seen. They marked prestige, not function. A different kind of closure, not of cloth, but of statement, and yet even here the illusion held. They looked like buttons, they played the part. But the actual fastening was often done elsewhere, hidden a zip, a clasp, a trick. These were buttons like stage props, hollow, gleaming, mute. Elsewhere, in the hands of artists and artisans, buttons found second lives, collaged into portraits, stitched into quilts, sewn onto canvas, arranged in spirals and constellations. The tactile language of repetition, of pattern and pause. The button was not asked to fasten, only to appear again, and again like a motif in a half-remembered song. Some artists spoke of them as timekeepers, others as metaphors. A button, after all, was always about joining fabric to fabric, body to garment, intention to form. The button also made its quiet way into metaphor, to push someone's buttons. Cute as a button. Button up. The word threaded itself into language, a soft hinge between action and image. In such phrases, the button became psychological, emotional, behavioral. To press a button was to trigger something hidden. To be buttoned up was to be closed, restrained, proper. To be unbuttoned, disheveled, open, human. Language preserved what the eye often forgot, that buttons were never just objects, but negotiations. In prisons and psychiatric hospitals, buttons were sometimes forbidden. Laces, belts, and buttons, all removed. Anything that could be used to tie, bind, harm. There, clothing was fastened with Velcro or elastic. Practical, yes, but the absence was felt. To not be trusted with a button was to be marked as incomplete, dangerous, unwool. The absence of a small closure left a large silence. Even in death, buttons remained. Funeral clothes often included them, as they always had. The body, dressed, was sent off with fastenings intact, as though the journey beyond might be draughty. In war graves and buried ruins, buttons outlasted fabric, skin, memory. Found by archaeologists, they mark not only time, but class, origin, intention. A single button identified correctly could redraw a narrative, a regiment's route, a soldier's origin, a missing child's last known location. It is a heavy thing to hold such a small weight. There are museums, scattered and stubborn, devoted to buttons. In museums within museums, tiny drawers are pulled open with soft clicks, each compartment labeled in careful cursive. Bone, brass, celluloid, glass. The air is still. The lighting low. Visitors speak less here. Some exhibitions are national, French military buttons from the Napoleonic campaigns. Others are domestic, novelty buttons from American children's coats in the 1960s. The human eye passes over them quickly. The mind slows down later. If you listen closely, you might still hear it, the quiet click of a button against a wooden floor, long after it's rolled under the radiator. The softened sigh of a tailor's breath as the final button is sewn, the thread knotted, the garment held whole. These are not grand sounds, but they are persistent. They linger. Like the scent of starch in a freshly ironed collar, or the subtle scratch of fingernail against fabric in search of a misaligned buttonhole. The button in its longest silence remained the guardian of form. Not loud, not proud, but always ready to close, to anchor, to connect. Not as ornament, not as mechanism, but as memory made visible. It asks nothing but alignment, and it offers nothing but cohesion. It is a quiet kind of faith. And as fashion spun forward toward speed, toward novelty, toward garments worn only once and discarded, the button stood its ground like a librarian in a nightclub, still muttering rules under the beat. It asked for patience where none was left, and it offered no thrill but certainty. It refused, quite gently, to change. The whisper of thread being drawn through cotton sleeves had not grown louder, only rarer. In the world of uniforms, that quiet theater of hierarchy and discipline, buttons remained essential. They did not only fasten, they signified. Rows of gold, rows of silver, rows lacquered in regulation blue. The button told you who was who. A naval officer's coat, meticulously pressed, with polished brass buttons that caught the low light of a corridor. That was not merely clothing. It was structure, command, role. Each button bore its insignia like a sigh held too long. Children learned this language before they knew they had. A school blazer, a choir robe, a scouting uniform. The action of doing up each button before a ceremony or a march, it was formative. You remembered it long after you forgot the words to the song or the way home. The button gave order to a ritual, and in doing so, gave the ritual to memory. Even in private life, the button choreographed intimacy. The slow undoing of buttons, not torn open but released one by one, is among the quietest forms of permission. A tenderness lived in that pause, that soft resistance. Unlike the zip or the snap, the button did not yield instantly. It required presence. Fingers moved deliberately. There was room for second thoughts. Or second hopes. The breath of two people in such moments, one still, one moving, carried the weight of theater, of kindness, of risk. Still, the world moved away. Athleisure triumphed. Stretch fabric. Elastic waistbands. Pullovers and hoodless hoodies. The button was too slow, too fiddly, too human. And yet it remained. Like a ritual no longer needed but still performed out of reverence, it found its place in detail. The button was no longer central, but it was still there, like punctuation in a sentence that had learned to speak in emojis. There were factories that continued to make buttons in the old way, hand-dyed Carozzo, horn-harvested from ethical sources. Wooden buttons carved and sanded with breath-held precision. These were not nostalgic exactly. They were persistent. In an age of digital immediacy, they whispered something older. But the hand, and only the hand, knows when a thread is tight enough. The soundscape in such places was different. No great machines, no fluorescent urgency. Just the quiet drag of twine over beeswax, the snip of scissors, the sigh of a stool being adjusted. Collectors, those patient archivists of this seemingly pointless, knew the power of a button. Not in value, buttons rarely held that, but in presence. A single button, retrieved from a floodplain, from a mass grave, from a theater floor, became a shard of narrative. A complete button was a relic, a broken one, poetry. Whole or halved, each could name a century, a class, a habit. Some bore initials. Some bore none, but still said something through wear or warp or hue, like a thumbprint left in lacquer. And so the button persisted not in use, but in metaphor, in memory, in mystery. It did not plead for attention. It did not evolve to remain relevant. It remained relevant by refusing to evolve. In the end, we return not to innovation, but to use. To the gesture of doing up a shirt in silence before an interview. To reattaching a lost button on a child's school coat and smoothing the lapel as if that small act were enough to stave off the chaos of the day. To finding a button in a drawer and not remembering what it belonged to, only that it was once needed. That it still is. The light in the gallery dims just slightly, the brass railings still warm beneath the curator's hand. Somewhere far behind us, a coat is being taken off, slowly, carefully, one button at a time. There were buttons that traveled farther than their garments ever could. Buttons buried with soldiers later unearthed in faraway lands, their enamel chipped, their insignia half erased. Buttons that rode sea currents inside lost coats thrown overboard, lodged in sandbanks or seabeds, becoming artifacts in waiting. A single brass button found on a shoreline could rewrite a shipwreck's tale. Objects of attachment long after their attachment had dissolved. The air around such findings often held no sound at all, only the imagined hush of waves retreating from an answer. Some buttons crossed borders not as debris, but as tokens. A button passed from parent to child, from a lost coat pocket sewn into a war bride's dress, from a prisoner's uniform pocket stitched into a lining, then carried west or north or simply away. They were not meant to be used again, just carried, as memory with weight. Something to hold in silence when there was no other proof left that someone had once fastened their life together. In industrial archaeology, buttons told truths. Found in workers' tunnels and collapsed mills, in ruined dormitories. Each material had its time. Bone preceded bakelite. Celluloid gave way to nylon. To trace a timeline of buttons is to read a sediment of chemistry, of fashion, of class. The button is never just a circle with holes. It is always also a map, not of place, but of time's method of folding upon itself. Like the scent of an old attic, mildew, paper, and the faintest trace of soap from another century. And then there were the buttons we imagined, fictional ones. The red button in films not sewn but pushed. Final, irrevocable, a metaphor weaponized. To press the button is to commit, to launch, to delete. We made it large, lit, encased in glass, but we still called it a button. A word born from fastening was now tethered to annihilation. That linguistic migration from closure to catastrophe says something about us. Perhaps we trusted buttons too much. Children's stories softened it. Bears with buttons instead of eyes, dolls with button noses. Ragged companions stitched from scraps, their buttons always slightly askew. It gave them character. Unevenness became charm. In these tales, the button wasn't closure, it was personality. A sign of care made visible. The low rustle of storybook pages at bedtime, the smooth press of a thumb tracing the figure's stitched face. These sounds, too, belong to the button. Some fashion historians mark the button's golden age in the early 19th century. Others claim it never ended, only dissolved as important things do into habit. Even now, high fashion still flirts with buttons, though more as concept than closure. Oversized, deliberately placed, sometimes non-functional, a commentary, an echo. But the basic four-hole, plain front, functional button, the kind on your pillowcase, your cardigan, your winter coat continues to endure without needing to be seen. In hospice settings, caregivers sometimes speak of final clothing, garments chosen with care. Dressed not for function, but for leaving. The fastening of that last button slowly, with dignity, becomes a ceremony, not theatrical, not spoken. Just done, the quiet slide of cotton against skin, the slight resistance of a button pressed home. A sound no louder than breath and just as sacred. There were buttons that fooled the eye, painted wood to look like tortoise, dyed shell to mimic stone. They didn't aspire to be more than button-ends, they simply wanted to fit, to match. And so much of the button's work was not to stand out, but to vanish into the garment, to be present only in function. That was its paradox, designed to be touched but not seen. A tool of intimacy disguised as absence. Even now, in the age of voice commands and seamless seams, the button waits in places we forget, on old mattress covers, on duvet cases, on the cuffs of inherited coats. It is not loud, it does not blink, it does not require charging. It simply waits a small deliberate point of contact between intention and completion. The room cools slightly. The quiet hum of the display case grows softer. And somewhere far beyond these halls, someone is threading a needle with tired hands and careful breath. Not for art, not for metaphor, just to sew a button back on. There is a particular tenderness in that gesture, sewing a button back on. It is not ambitious. It solves nothing large. But it restores a circle. It answers a question asked silently by fabric each time it gapes. The needle moves through cloth like a slow breath through memory, carrying not just thread but the echo of hands that once mended the same way. Somewhere a coat grows whole again, and with it, so does the day. The homes of buttonmakers were once heavy with dust, but also with pride. In workshops across the Black Forest, in Parisian ateliers, in Birmingham's jewelry quarter, entire families passed down the patterns, not just for the buttons themselves, but for the machines that made them hum. Not loud, but precise. You could hear it through a wall, the soft rhythm of repetition, the click of a press, the sigh of a foot pedal. It sounded oddly like patience. Some buttons were never meant for clothing. Commemorative button-ends cast in brass, minted like coins. Campaign buttons bearing faces now forgotten. Buttons that marked union memberships or club affiliations or entry to a forgotten exhibition. You did not fasten them. They fastened you. a pin at the back, a slogan at the front. You wore them not for utility, but for belief. The faint metallic tang of oxidized brass on your coat, warmed by sunlight, was the only proof that something had once mattered. Elsewhere, in prisons of the 19th century, button rules were strict. Inmates were not allowed to face forward when fastening. They were made to dress in silence, buttons aligned under surveillance. The button here was not dignity, but discipline. Failure to fasten properly could earn punishment. And so it became a ritual of survival, practiced, rehearsed, executed with trembling care. In these institutions, the quiet sound of buttoning up became a small declaration: I am still here. And of course, the button was political. During wartime rationing, one was discouraged from replacing a lost button with anything new. Mending was patriotic. Resourcefulness was duty. A reused button spoke not of poverty but of character. Magazines printed guides for salvaging buttons before discarding garments. Some were carefully removed before burning ruined clothing. You could survive without a hem, but not without closure. That soft metallic scrape of buttons placed in a drawer, it sounded like resilience. There are love stories where the only trace left is a button. Slipped into a letter, dropped in a drawer, sewn into the lining of a diary, a small circle where the body once was. Unlike scent or ink or voice, a button endures without context. It does not fade, it does not explain, it simply is. And in this, it becomes more powerful not because it reveals, but because it confirms. Not all buttons are symmetrical. Some were pressed off-center, some drilled by hand, slightly skewed. Some warped in the kill, bent by heat or time. These are the ones we call unique. Not because they look different, but because they remind us that hands made them. That mistakes leave fingerprints more honest than design. If there is a memory of touch embedded in objects, the button holds more than its share, gripped by cold fingers in snow, tugged by a child resisting bedtime, lost in grass, searched for with desperate hands, stitched with tears, laughter, or neither. The button is among the few things that travels both inward and outward, intimate yet always on the edge of public display. And perhaps this is why it endures, not because it is strong, but because it is small enough to slip between things. Between cloth and skin, between need and gesture, between beginning and end, a circle unfinished and yet complete. The hallway narrows now, the light dims further. The hush is thicker, the air tinged with dry cotton and something older, a scent like forgotten drawers. Somewhere in the stillness, a coat remains on its hook. Its top button fastened, the others left open. And still the button waits. Not urgently, but faithfully, like a lantern left burning in a window whose watcher has long since fallen asleep. It waits on garments folded away for seasons that may never return. On wedding suits no longer worn, on christening gowns boxed in tissue, on uniforms kept for reasons no one remembers. Each one a small disk of silence sewn into fabric, holding the shape of what was once intended. In disaster zones, recovery teams sometimes find only fragments, a scrap of cloth, a shoe, a button, the rest gone. But the button, dense and stubborn, remains. It tells nothing, and yet it tells everything. Where something ended, that someone was there. The earth does not chew it easily. Water softens it, but does not dissolve it. Fire resists it longer than flesh or thread. It is among the last things to surrender. Buttons speak in patterns, too. A woman's blouse buttoned right over left. A man's shirt left over right. Why? Theories abound that women were dressed by others, men by themselves, that handedness mattered, that war and tailoring and fashion all conspired. But whatever the cause, the button helped write a language of gender into the fabric of clothing. One you rarely noticed until it confused you. Until you dressed in something not made for you, and the hands hesitated, puzzled at which side should cling closure. On hospital gowns, buttons are rare. Instead, ties, snaps, sometimes nothing at all. The body is not meant to stay covered. Efficiency triumphs over dignity. But in maternity wards and some corners of elder care, buttons persist. Because they mean something. Not to the designer, To the wearer, the act of fastening slowly, precisely, can be a form of reclamation, of choosing not to be undone. There are stories where a button is the key. Pressed in the right way, it opens a secret compartment, a hidden drawer, a concealed room. This is not accidental. The button, by nature, holds things closed, so its inverse becomes magic. In fairy tales and espionage novels, to find the right button is to find the hidden truth. To press it is to be transformed. And yet, in most lives, the button offers no secrets. It simply does what is asked, quietly, repeatedly, day after day. A shirt worn to work, a coat buttoned against wind, a pillowcase fastened. These are not heroic acts, but they are the architecture of continuity. Of small order in a larger mess, in cemeteries, buttons sometimes outlast names. Stony roads, ink fades. But dig, and beneath the soil you may find a button still intact. Rusted, yes. Cracked, perhaps. But present. The soil holds it like a word that no longer has a language. We can guess what it meant, but never be sure. Still we guess. And that act of guessing gives it new meaning. Among the Inuit, before contact with European cloth, buttons were often made of bone or carved ivory, used on parkas and gloves. They were not just fasteners, they were amulets. Carved with intent, worn with belief. Not to hold fabric, but to hold luck, or warmth, or the memory of a hunted seal. The air there was thick with snow and silence, and the button made no sound when fastened, but its meaning was loud. Every culture has its version. From coconut shell buttons in Polynesia to porcelain ones in Qing dynasty robes. Each said, "We close this, we hold this, we continue." The thread may change. The needle may pass hands, but the gesture stays. A line. Insert, pull, knot. The same now as then. A ritual of touch that cannot be digitized. And perhaps that is where the button draws its deepest power in being irreducibly physical. You cannot scroll a button. You cannot swipe it. You must feel it, press it, guide it through. It demands a kind of presence that the world increasingly forgets. The corridor head narrows further. The light barely glows. A display case stands with its velvet lining, and upon it a single unremarkable button, off-white, slightly chipped. 4 holes sewn once, perhaps twice. And though no plaque explains it, no spotlight shines on it, it holds its space with the quiet weight of something that was used well. In the archives, buttons are indexed with the same care as coins or stamps. Not because they are rare, though some are, but because they are precise. Each entry notes material, diameter, number of holes, thread type, backmark if present. A language of circles written in thread. Curators wear gloves. Not for show, but for reverence. The buttons do not resist touch, but they absorb it. Too many hands in the surface dulls, the detail wears. Even silence erodes when handled too often. Some buttons were faked like art. 18th century counterfeiters would cast buttons, bearing military insignia to pass as soldiers or smuggle contraband. A button hollowed out could carry powder, a message, a gem. Not glamorous espionage, just practical deceit. The button, so trusted, became perfect cover. And who, after all, would question a button? It fastens. It hides. It says nothing. At auction houses, certain buttons fetch high prices. Fabergé buttons. Georgian mourning buttons set with woven hair. Civil War relics. Yet for all their worth, they still share space in the same drawers as shirt buttons lost in laundromats. The hierarchy collapses in a jar. Value disperses. There is no real way to display a single button that can compete with the narrative weight of a handful. 5 or 6 of different kinds clinking faintly in a dish, that's a museum of time. In folk customs, buttons were once used in divination. Thrown like bones, counted for fortune. Placed under pillows to summon dreams of future lovers. A button warmed in the hand and whispered over became a kind of hinge between worlds, neither sacred nor profane, just close enough to the body to carry belief. You could sew a charm into a coat by hiding a button beneath the collar. The spell wasn't spoken, it was worn, and buttons found their way into music. Accordionists speak of buttons rather than keys, each one mapping tone to pressure. The concertina, the bandoneon, instruments pressed like coats, played like garments undone and redone with feeling. A sad melody breathed out of button breath, sighing in and out across folds like lungs remembering something they never lived. In times of protest, buttons were badges. Not fasteners, but slogans. Votes for women. Silence equals death. I like Ike. You did not wear them to hold your coat closed. You wore them to open your mouth. The click of a protest button pinned to a lapel was its own kind of fastening, a closure of hesitation, an opening of intent. In old theater costumes, buttons were critical. Period accuracy depended on them. To wear a 1790 coat with 1820 buttons, an error only noticed by those who cared. And that was the point. Buttons became time signals, minute, overlooked, but essential. Like stage whispers, not meant to be heard, but meant to be there. Even astronauts had buttons, though not the kind sewn with thread. Suits were fastened with complex press-lock systems. But the control panels in the Apollo capsules had real physical buttons. Each one carefully tested, labeled, mapped. The act of pressing a button in space carried the same intimacy as buttoning a cuff on Earth, a point of contact between decision and event. A small press, a large effect, but only if done with care, and care is the button's essence. To fasten is to pause, to select, to aim. It is not impatient. A zipper is faster. Velcro is louder. Magnets are more forgiving. But the button waits for the hand to find it, the right way, the slow way. It gives nothing until you ask. And then it gives everything, closure. The air here is quiet now, as if the museum itself were buttoned up for the night. A last display case, its glass slightly fogged with time, holds nothing but a black coat on a form. One button missing, another loose. A thread hanging. And still it holds its shape. It stands, not ruined, only waiting. The button is not an invention that changed the world. It is not a wheel, nor a wire, nor a weapon. It is not credited with winning wars or birthing revolutions. But it has been present at all of them. It held collars in place as treaties were signed. It fastened cuffs as letters were written, arrests made, lovers kissed goodbye on train platforms thick with smoke. The button does not boast. It simply endures like a witness who never speaks but never looks away. In psychiatric case notes from the 19th century, one finds odd mentions, patients sewing buttons obsessively, collecting them, hiding them in shoes or under pillows. The act was labeled compulsion. Perhaps it was. But perhaps, too, it was a search for order. For something small that could be placed, aligned, completed. In a mind coming undone, the button might have been the last thing that still made sense. And there is a loneliness to the button. Unlike a zipper, it does not work alone. It needs its partner, a hole, a slit, a loop. It exists in relation. You cannot button without something to button into. In this way, the button reminds us of ourselves separate, incomplete, made meaningful only in connection. And when it breaks or goes missing, the loss is not of function, but of belonging. There are buttons sewn into dresses never worn, into coats bought for someone who never returned, into garments stored for futures that never came. These buttons are the quietest, never touched, never used, but full of potential. They are the punctuation marks at the end of a sentence never written, and still they hold their shape. They are ready. In the digital age, the word lives on. Click the button, subscribe, power button. But the shape has changed. The sound has vanished. The resistance is gone. A real button offers friction. It resists slightly. It gives only when persuaded. You press it and it remembers. You fasten it and it holds. This is not nostalgia. It is difference. There is something that lives only in the physical. In the act of threading one world through the loop of another. Some buttons were misfit from the beginning, wrong size, wrong color, sewn in haste, but still they tried, they held on. And this too is part of the story. Not perfection, but persistence. The sound of a jacket being buttoned in a rush, 1, 2, skip the third, is the sound of being late, being human, being real. The button forgives. It does not demand elegance, only effort. In films, buttons are rarely central, but they are often there unnoticed. The slow undoing of a blouse before a confession, a single button left open on a detective's coat, the nervous fiddling with the sleeve's edge in a moment of doubt. The camera doesn't linger, but we do. Something about the gesture stays. Because buttons are where our hands go when our words fail. And yes, there are entire garments without them now. Tunics, wraps, pullovers, but even there we echo the logic. A snap is a fast button. A magnetic closure is a hidden button. We haven't moved past it, we've only disguised it. The desire to fasten remains. The need to align, to close, to make secure, it does not leave us. In the quietest rooms of old houses, wardrobes never opened, coats never worn, the buttons are asleep. Dust does not stop them. Time does not rot them quickly. Even if the cloth frays they wait, one day someone might reach in, might find it still holding, might run a thumb across its face and feel the echo of every hand that ever did the same. And then, quietly, the hand might reach for a needle and begin. To begin again, that is the button's quiet promise. Not by changing, not by growing, but simply by holding steady. It is one of the few human-made things that requires no upgrade. No newer version of the button has replaced the old. 4 holes remain 4 holes. The thread still loops as it did a century ago. Its evolution ended when it worked, and from then on it only varied. In funerary inventories from the Victorian period, garments were listed down to their closures. Black wool coat, 7 horn buttons intact. Cambric dress, 3 buttons missing, 2 replaced. Even in death, buttons mattered, not for the mourners. For the record, the last note of order before the garment was boxed or burned or passed along. The final detail, quietly confirming that someone once cared enough to keep a thing closed. We seldom speak of buttonholes. And yet, without them, the button is inert, passive, unusable. The hole is what gives the button its meaning and its chance. Often hand-cut, often imperfect. Sometimes stretch, sometimes too tight, but always essential. The button waits for the world to open slightly and men enter it. It is a joining act. A small, soft insistence that form can hold. At wakes and vigils, people often fiddle with buttons, turning one in their fingers, opening, closing. It is not distraction. It is tactile grief. Something to hold that gives slightly, resists gently, returns reliably. The world phrase. The button answers with one small loop of order, one task that can still be done, one thing that still obeys. Tailors, true tailors, speak of buttons not as accessories but as punctuation. A jacket is a sentence, the lapels are the clause, the pockets the aside, the button full stop. And like all punctuation, it demands precision. Too high and the garment strains. Too low and it sags. Some crooked and the whole line falls apart. The thread may be strong, but the placement must be right, or else the whole sentence whispers wrong. There were buttons carved with symbols, not merely decorative, but declarative, anchors for sailors, wings for pilots, stars, lions, crowns, and sometimes simpler things, an acorn, a leaf, a spiral. To wear such a button was to be part of something, or to remember something, or to hope for something. The button became a whisper sewn into fabric. Not loud, but present. In refugee camps, buttons are traded. Not for money, but for stitching. A child's coat missing one. A blanket fastened at the throat. A plastic bag tied shut with thread in a single 2-hole disc. The button again becomes dignity, privacy, protection. In a world where little fits, it lets something close. We often outgrow our button-ends, not all at once, but gradually. The coat too tight, the collar too sharp, the waist pulling just slightly. And so the button becomes a measure of time, of change, of softness gone rigid, or strength newly gained. It tells us without judgment when we are no longer the person who wore that thing. It simply holds until we no longer ask it to. In dreams, buttons appear more often than we'd expect. Poured from jars, lost in sand, stitched to skin. Psychological symbols, yes, of closure, of restraint, of memory, but also of repetition, of the loop, the cycle, things that must be done again, and again, and again. And so, as we drift through this gallery of the quiet, we begin to see the button is not just history. It is rhythm, loop and pull, fasten and release, hold and let go. And the worn notebooks of old laundresses and housekeepers. One finds notes like button missing, left cuff, or a reinforced top buttonhole. These were not complaints. They were acts of care, of bearing witness. The garments were not theirs. But the button as the fragile hinge between someone's skin and the world mattered enough to record. There is something quietly radical in that, to treat a small closure as a meaningful event. In schoolrooms of the past, children learned to sew buttons before they learned to write cursive. A thimble, a needle, a circle of cloth, a button. The stitch was taught not as decoration, but as survival. If you can sew on a button, the teacher might murmur, you'll never be useless. It was not romantic, it was factual. You could be cold poor alone. But if you could close what was opened, you could go on. Buttons also gathered scent. That faint accumulation of fabric softener, smoke, perfume, skin. Unlike metal jewelry or digital things, buttons absorbed. Not dramatically, but slowly, like pages taking on the air of a room. To press your nose to an old overcoat's button, dry wood, faint cologne, autumn air, it is a kind of ghost. Not a people, but of use. In mental institutions of the early 20th century, buttons were sometimes removed entirely from clothing. Not only for safety, but to simplify dressing. No decisions. No alignments, just pull over, tie shut. Yet patients sewed them back on, out of scraps, with dental floss, even hair. Buttons made from bread, hardened, not to close anything, just to feel real. Somewhere between form and metaphor, the button became art. In textile galleries, vast tapestries of buttons stitched together, shades of cream and pearl graduated in hue. Or installations where buttons fall from ceilings like slow, silent snow. They clatter gently on wooden floors like a pause from a very patient ghost. In literature, the button appears rarely, but when it does, it signals turning points. A button lost, and with it, control. A button found, and with it, memory. In children's books, it often means identity. The button sewn on by the grandmother, the friend, the caretaker. It becomes a token, a proof that someone thought of you carefully, precisely. That you were fastened to the world on purpose. In war, the button played strange roles. Soldiers stitched messages under buttons. Lovers kept buttons as keepsakes. In prisoner of war camps, buttons were sometimes ground down into gaming pieces, not to gamble, simply to pass time. To count something. To hold something. One small, smooth circle in the palm, a reminder that something could be held even now. In marriage traditions, a groom's buttonhole became a floral arrangement. A bloom pinned beside closure, softness meeting structure. The boutonniere, a final touch before vows. And in some traditions, buttons were removed before burial, an unfastening. A release, the garment no longer needed to close. The body no longer needed to stay. Every thread used for a button is a wager. It will hold, it will last. But we know eventually it will loosen. It will fray, we sew anyway. The motion is not foolish. It is faithful. And that is perhaps the most human part of the button. Not that it functions, but that it waits to be undone and never complains. That it exists to close something, and to trust that hands will open it again when the time is right. The hallway now narrows to a whisper. The light barely glows. And from somewhere far, far away, perhaps from your own closet, perhaps from memory, comes the softest sound. A button sliding home, followed by the slow breath of something at last complete. There are those who collect buttons not for beauty or value, but for story. Not the story of manufacture, but of moment. This one from the coat I wore to the hospital the day she was born. This from his uniform. This fell off during the fire. Tiny reliquaries, these buttons. Carried in tins, jars, envelopes marked only with a date. To the outside eye, they are meaningless. To the holder, they are anchors, not to objects, but to time. The museums that house them understand this. Not every button behind glass is remarkable. Some are cracked, some common, some without origin. But their presence insists this, too, held something together once. This, too, mattered. And if you listen long enough, the quiet becomes loud. You begin to hear the echo of hands threading, fastening, mending. The whisper of people who never asked to be remembered, only to be held. In repair shops, tailors still speak of the good thread, thicker, waxed, meant to last. They keep it in drawers, separate from the others. It's used on button-ins that we'll see wear, not decorative ones. Working ones. Ones on coat fronts, on trousers, on bags carried every day. The thread is darker, stronger. Sometimes red, not to be seen, but to remind the tailor, I was here with care. And care is a rare thing now. Clothes arrive fast, leave faster. Few mend. Fewer notice. But those who do, who sit down, thread needle, align cloth so slowly, are part of something older than trend. They're part of the unbroken circle. The loop of hand to thread to button to cloth to hand again, not for display, for use. In fiction, the villain presses a button to launch the missile. But even here the metaphor persists. A button is still what connects intention to consequence. It still needs a finger, a pause, a breath before contact. We chose that word, button, not by mistake. Because deep down we understand, something should happen only when touched deliberately. Among the elderly, some have what they call the button tin. Passed down, unchanged. A lifetime of odd closures saved just in case. And though the case rarely comes, the buttons remain. A galaxy of form and color. Too many to use, but impossible to throw away. Because each one could fit, could be needed, could someday be the difference between keeping and discarding a thing once loved. And if you think about it, really think the button is one of the last things we still use with both hands, not out of necessity, but out of care. The left holds steady, the right guides through, or vice versa. It is a gesture that predates the mirror. That reminds the body it was made for small tasks, for deliberate acts, for fastening the world gently to itself. Sometimes the strongest bonds are not knots, but loops. Not loud, but secure. The button holds not by force, but by fit. It teaches that closure doesn't require pressure, only alignment. That being held is not the same as being trapped. That function and comfort are not opposites. And in that way, the button becomes an ethic. Not just an object, but a way of being, reliable, unassuming, whole, willing to be undone and redone endlessly, never proud, never resentful, just present, waiting. The final hallway is almost silent now, no velvet, no glass. Only a soft wooden bench and a coat draped across it, one button missing, one held with a thread barely clinging. And though the coat will never be worn again, it still looks ready. It still keeps its shape. It still says, I'm not undone. And so the history of the button ends not with an invention, but with a return. We have traced its materials, shell, bone, horn, resin, plastic, each shaped into circles of closure. We have followed it through the hands of tailors, soldiers, children, mourners. We have seen it drilled, cast, carved, discarded, sewn, saved. And now we find ourselves back where we began, at the quiet edge of utility, holding something that might no longer fasten but still remains. There is no final innovation to the button. It did not get smarter. It did not connect to Wi-Fi. It remained honest. It did not try to become something else. Its humility is its endurance. Even as garments grow stranger, seamless, algorithmic, self-heating, self-cleaning, some still have buttons, not because they must, but because someone somewhere chose them, chose slowness, chose tradition. Chose that little moment of pause before going out into the weathered world. The ecological irony, of course, is that the button, once a symbol of care and mending, is now mass-produced in billions. Many are never used. Many are sewn onto clothes destined for landfill. Buttons made of plastic, once a marvel, now drift in the ocean, line the stomachs of birds. A device born to hold now floats untethered. This, too, is part of the story. The button is innocent, but it does not escape the systems it's stitched into. And still the gesture survives. In thrift stores, someone picks up a shirt and tests the buttons, runs fingers down the front. Here's the soft pat-pat of closure. Decides, yes, this can still be worn, this can be fastened again, or not. Sometimes the button remains even when the cloth has failed. The thread dissolves, the seams come apart, but the button lies there, waiting for its next garment, or none at all. Perhaps one day we will stop wearing buttons. Perhaps closure will become gesture-based or thought-driven or abandoned entirely in favor of elasticity. But even then, the button will linger in language. To button up, to be a button-down person, to press someone's buttons. These phrases won't fade quickly. They carry more than function. They carry implication, culture, memory, because the button is not just something we used, it's something we trusted. With our modesty, with our warmth, with our presentation to the world. A button done up says, I am ready. I am held. I am for the moment whole. So ends the factual history. The dates dissolve. The patents fade. The factories grow quiet. But the shape remains. A small disc, a center, a thread. A promise. The button is no longer just a tool. It has become a mirror, soft-edged, silent but constant, reflecting the human desire for order in a fraying world. We do not fasten it only to close garments. We fasten it to affirm something, that the world, chaotic though it may be, still allows small things to align, still permits coherence in circles and loops, still offers closure even when meaning is scarce. To sew on a button is to refuse disposability. It is to say, I will not throw this away. Not yet. I will mend. I will try again. It is the quietest ethic, not of revolution, but of resilience. Not a shout, but a whisper. I remain, I restore, I remember. That whisper travels down the thread, into the cloth, into the day. It touches nothing grand and everything sacred. There is no ambition in the button. It does not seek progress. It does not promise improvement. It is content to be what it is, again and again, not timeless, but endlessly timely. What else do we have like that? What else repeats itself so patiently, so willingly, for so little attention and so much necessity? In a world of constant opening, tabs, feeds, scrolling pages, the button reminds us how to close, not to shut out, but to hold in, to keep warm, to complete. It does not resist change. It just holds it together for a while. We often forget how radical that is, not to push forward, not to undo, just to hold softly until the next breath arrives. And there is deep philosophy in that, in the decision not to replace but to repair, not to improve but to care. The button is not beautiful by default. It becomes beautiful by remaining. And so do we. We are button creatures, joined by small acts, looped through with memory, fastened loosely to one another, to our histories, to our sense of self, not knotted, never trapped, but held, willingly, lovingly, with thread that may fray, yes, but thread that can be replaced, and the whole, the button they wait. Even in grief, the button teaches, to unbutton a coat after a funeral, to remove a child's coat and save it, just in case. These are not grand gestures. They are small closures, rituals of hand and cloth and breath. The button does not lessen the grief, but it gives the fingers something to do while the heart adjusts, and it offers us this, the right to continue slowly, to move from undone to done at a pace we choose, to make the world whole not with noise, but with care. In this, the button becomes a philosophy of resistance, to waste, to haste, to abstraction. One hole, two, thread, stitch, pull, tie, done. The language spoken not with words, but with presence. Yes, let us close it gently as all closures should be. Because in the end, the button is not what we wear, but how we remember, a circle of small dignity. A refusal to let go before it is time. A fastening of fabric, yes, but also of gesture, of rhythm, of meaning. It tells us that care is not dramatic, that attention is quiet. That wholeness, however temporary, is worth the work. And so the button rests again, soft in memory, flexible in meaning, always ready to begin anew.